Hello, selectors, and welcome to the Lifeburst podcast, where we talk about Wixossy things.
All the Wixossy things.
Tiffany, you joined me for this one.
I am. Hello. I know. I know. I've been MIA, so it's good to be back.
Yeah. Hey. You wanted to talk about this topic.
I did.
Which surprises me because this is like one of our guys. If you like the fun episodes where we're talking about nuts and bolts, this is not one of them.
It's not for you.
This is one where you go deep into deck theory land about things that don't matter and concepts that are very vague.
I mean, it's not necessarily vague. It's just very abstract.
It's going to be very abstract.
It's a little abstract, but okay. Yeah, I really want this. This is a topic that got me really excited.
It all came off of one specific thing you said, and I was like, no!
Yes, this podcast actually spurred off of an out-and-out argument.
You're just walking our dog, and I was like, no!
That Andrew and I had. And it all stemmed because I said, a card in the hand is worth 2 in the enter. And Andrew had major feelings about that phrase. And it spurred into this whole discussion that we had, and at the end of it I was like, we have to make a podcast about this because this is actually pretty, I find it fascinating. Yeah. Maybe I'm just a nerd. So today we're going to be going over the concept of resources / currencies in Wixoss.
Right. So it is not a stretch to say that card games are resource management games.
Yes.
They are. That's just what they are. Magic, your resources, mana, and cards in hand, and you're figuring out your best way to utilize those. With Wixoss, you figuring out your resources. Hell, even your Lifeburst is a resource, right? That you got to look at and be like, I will lose this game unless I get a free resource that will come from my Lifeburst.
Yes.
Right. So everything is. Or all these card games, generally speaking, are resources that you can figure out how to use. However, a lot of them are different, right? Like cards in hand and enter in your enter zone and Signy that are in your plate and how many cards are in your deck. These are all different resources, right? And you'll find that the most successful decks, generally speaking, run a mix of resources that also don't touch each other a ton, right? Like, for example, the most free resource that you could do is Exceed or Harmony. Harmony is one that we didn't write down that we should actually write down that I'm thinking about.
Okay, I'll write it down.
And it's like, it is, how do you manage all those resources? And what are they worth, right? Like, that's the thing that
was kind of the core concept of this, is how much is a card actually worth in Wixoss?
Right, and that question is actually more relevant than ever with MGD existing, right?
Which is
Machina Guardian Dragon, which asks you to pay a following cost, either discard 3 cards or pay 3 enter or any mix of that. The question then is, if I discard 3 cards, is that cheaper than paying 3 enter?
And before we go much further, leave it in the comment section down below what you think, and then comment again at the end and see if we've changed your minds. Yeah.
Or if you agree with us, at least.
Yeah, if you agree.
And so something I learned very early on from actually Magic the Gathering, but it's actually helped me in my career even, which was that you can equate currencies that are dissimilar if you find and make assumptions to make them able to be the same. So for example, I know how much we love getting mathy on this show, which actually,
well, hold on, let's go over the list of
I'm not going over any specifics yet.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to say is that in algebra, this is where Tiffany rolls her eyes at me. Aggro, I smash.
I know math good, okay?
I can count to 8. That's enough to kill you, and we
Stop.
I'm not making fun of you. That is actually a very important mathematical number in Wixoss.
Strike theory, go check out that video.
Is that like in algebra, in order to solve some forms of equations, you need to make a guess as to how to make them the same, right? So if you're trying to figure out a test score and what that means, right? You have to then take, if there's 50 questions, but it's out of 100%, you need to go ahead and make that 50 into 100, so that way you can then be like, oh, I made this score, right? Like that's the way that fractions work. And it's sort of the same, right? In real life, you can, for example, figure out time, because time equals money, if you think of hourly pay. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's a way that you can actually quantify an unquantifiable figure like time or effort into money.
Into money.
Wixoss, you can do the same. For example, how much is cards worth in your hand in terms of money? And our version of money is Ener.
Yeah. Or just in raw card value.
Right.
Which is why we're going to be referring to things as currency, because you pay for them.
Right.
Or you use it to pay for something.
For example, is Lancelot better than Pennsylvania natural element?
Oh my god.
PA natural element. PA natural element asks you to discard 2 cards, and then you can give Signy negative 8,000. Lancelot, you pay 1 Ener. You can kill something that's 5,000, right? And aside from the numbers being different, 5,000, 8,000, let's say that you were targeting something that was 3,000, so it doesn't matter anyways. What's better, discarding 2 cards or paying an Ener? And that's the question, right? That's like Wixoss is starting to ask that question quite a bit.
Yes, especially in a set 5, there's going to be a lot of variables flying around and a lot of micro decisions that you're going to have to make, and a lot of it's going to come down to what do you have,
right,
and what can you pay for?
That's one of the small edges that you can get, right? Like, why is Madoka Clap and Lion Disrespect better than Dea's Shield? Dea's Shield costs 6, and its breakpoints are 3 and 3 Ener. Whereas Madoka Clap and Lion have a crap ton of choices that you can make, right? It can block 2 damage, but sometimes that's 2 Ener and 2 cards. Sometimes it's 5 Ener, sometimes it's 3 things, but it's also 5 Ener and 2 cards. Like, it's a mix of things, right? So, and it might be better that you're using 2 different resources to make this happen instead of 3 or instead of 1, because you might just be limited on 1 or bottlenecked on 1. But without any further ado, Tiff, you got the list that we came up with.
All right. So the currencies that we're going to be going over today, it's a little bit of a long list, but we're going to be discussing some more than others. So we've got Ener, cards in hand, cards in the deck, cards in the trash, cards that you use to exceed, Signies on the field, souls, grows, or lyrigs that you use to grow, cards that you use to grow, pieces, and life cloth. That's a lot of stuff flying around, but maybe you guys will have noticed that all of these things are cards that you use to pay for something, or that is something that you pay for.
Right.
So that's why we're calling it currencies,
right,
and that's why we're trying to figure out what is a card worth depending on where it is.
And what it does.
So let's get started with equating Ener. Like, what is a card in the Ener worth?
Right. And so it is easy to think I get 1 Ener a turn, because you have a choice of getting 1 Ener a turn if you want to put a card from your hand or the field into the Ener. So Ener right now, you start thinking, oh, it's a pretty difficult resource to get a hold of. That is until you realize that if your opponent attacks you, and if your opponent vanishes all of your field, generally speaking, Wixoss promotes, and opens up those lanes and then attacks you all those times, right? And then also attacks you with their Elrig. They could remove 3 things on the field, hit you 3 times, and then hit you with an Elrig attack. bringing that number up to 7, plus 1 that you can put in there. So 8.
Yeah.
You theoretically could have 8 enter given to you in a turn.
There's definitely been turns that I've had where, like, yeah, I could block some of the damage, but, like, why would I? I need the enter.
Right.
So I feel like off of that note, enter's, like, it's kind of a cheap resource.
It's pretty a cheap
like,
resource. if
It's
you look at it
very
that way.
easy for you to get enter back. Like, there's a lot of ways that you can do it. So I think we're equating enter to 1 enter is worth 1 card.
1 enter is worth 1 enter.
1 enter is worth 1 enter.
But how it's like, it's more like is enter to use a weird metaphor, is enter an enter or is it a yen? You know, like, one of those things is you need a lot more of to equal to the same thing, right? So for example, we get a lot of enter in Wixoss naturally because the opponent's going to get rid of cards on your field,
Which then go into the enter.
right? Usually to a turn, and you are going to get smacked some amount of the time, right? We're turn 4, turn 5 format,
Where your life cloth will also go into the enter.
right? So how much enter are you really getting? I think if you're probably losing the game if you're getting 8 enter a turn, right?
Yeah,
on
that's
return
not
rotation.
a good look. I feel like on average you're probably going to get like 2.5 enter a turn.
Yeah, plus
Just-
maybe the enter that you can dive in there.
Yeah,
so
like
3.5.
2.5 to 3.5 is what I would say you would gain a turn.
Yeah.
So that's a relatively renewable resource for you, and that's kind
Right.
of why it's our like 1-to-1 ratio.
Right.
So what about cards in hand? Now, remember, this is the one that sparked this entire debate. How much is a card worth when it's in your hand?
The funny thing is sometimes it also matters what color you're in, right? Because, like, green doesn't get cards in hand very often.
Yeah.
A red can filter really well, but has a hard time getting excess cards in their hand. Black, white, and blue are, like, they can get as many cards in their hand as they want. So
Yeah, some colors have a more disposable hand than others.
but what you and I looked at was black cards, white cards, and blue cards. Generally the colors that are helping you draw, aka the colors that you're going to make this decision for mostly. And we looked at a bunch of them. Things like Arcwayne, things like Good Dig, various Lifebursts that are free, various once-a-games or various assist Elrigs. Often the level 1 draw 2 is one for free. Yay!
Yeah.
We look, Tamago does it for like 1 at level 2 and draws you an extra 2 cards, right? So when you start looking at those numbers, you go and you basically you can average them out. And what we found was how much?
We said that a card in the hand can be worth anywhere from a 0.5 point to 1.
Right. So a half an enter to an enter.
Half an enter to an enter.
And guys, we're equating a lot of these things into enter because that's like the common resource.
Yeah, I mean, you can think of it as enter. I guess you could think of it as like resource points if you're like a D&D player.
Yeah.
But enter is your main like resource, so that's why we're equating it to enter.
So we're just equating all this stuff to enter. How much enter would you pay for this? And that kind of makes it a little easier to understand, right? Because the discarding cards, how much is that worth enter wise? So if we're talking about drawing cards here, right, or replacing the cards, we want to spend about a half an enter to an enter on getting another card in our hand.
Right. Now, the reason why I said that cards in the hand I think are worth more than a card in the enter zone is because in my mind, if you were to get rid of a card in the enter zone, so what? It goes in your trash. It's served its purpose. The end. But if you get rid of a card in your hand, like let's say you had to discard a card, right? That is one less card that you can use to further the game. Unless you're doing like trash recursion, which we're not there yet. So that's why, in my mind, I felt like, or I kind of still do kind of feel like, a card in the hand is worth more than a card in the enter because there's so much more that you can do with a card when it's played from your hand. Whether
Sure.
it's a spell, you put a Signy on the field, and then you can pay in it, like for a hand wheel, you
Sure.
can then pay an enter. So
I'd argue that potential energy and kinetic energy are two separate things, and you're looking at the potential energy of the card in hand, and not necessarily what it does as a game function. So, for example, right? Let's just take a random scenario here. You have 6 cards in hand. You have 3 cards that you're going to play and attack with. That's your goal, right? You play those 3 cards. How many cards do you have in your hand?
3.
Cool. On your next turn, how many cards do you draw?
2. So now you have 5.
Right. And then you're going to play...
1 to the enter.
Sure.
Now you have 4.
Right. And then you're going to play 3 cards, probably?
Most likely.
Cool.
2 to 3, yeah. So now you've got 2?
2 cards in hand, right?
Yeah.
Whereas, if you use your enter, it's gone. Right?
Right.
My point is that it's actually pretty easy to get cards in hand in this game. You draw 2 a card turn. You have Lifeburst that give you 1, generally speaking, often. And you have a bunch of ways through your assist L rigs and your pieces to just draw more.
Yeah, but that costs you cards to do it.
It costs you an enter, half an enter usually.
I mean, it doesn't cost you a half enter. It either does not cost you
I
an
know,
enter,
I know.
or it does cost you
But
an enter.
sometimes that effect is tacked on to effect, right?
Sure.
So, for example, if I'm playing a Signy that I can pay an enter and draw a card with, right, like Haniel or something, I'm also getting the Signy that I'm playing to do that. So the cost is 1 to have a Signy that's playable and also draw a card. So it's like you're paying half an enter, kind of, because you can get more.
A hay penny, if you will.
Well, you can also play a spell that draws you 3 cards for 1 enter, but you didn't get a Signy out of that deal. Like you drew some extra cards, but you didn't get a thing that replaces itself. The effect also counts as card advantage.
Right.
So my point is that if it's easy enough, like, okay, counterpoint. It costs 1 enter to draw 2 cards in our scenario here, because we're saying that it can cost anywhere from half an enter to a full enter.
Right.
To replace cards in hand, right? So if you have 1 enter and X amount of cards in hands, especially ones that can draw you cards, don't you have more resource in that scenario with your cards in hand?
Can you repeat that?
Okay, so for example,
you have 1
enter, and you have cards in hand that can replace themselves.
Okay.
Which do you have more of a resource of?
The cards in your hand, because
Correct.
you can replenish them?
Right.
Okay.
I'm not saying, look, if you're playing a deck that only discards cards, yeah, you're in for a bad game, because if you're playing a deck that has a huge amount of enter costs and also has no other way to use other resources, and you don't have the enter to play for all those costs, you aren't going to pay for those costs. But my point is that because you start the game with basically 6 cards in hand, and it's very easy to replenish the cards in your hand until late game, you end up with more cards in hand than you do enter. Little bit in the late game, it swaps. You have more enter than you have cards in hand.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah,
But
you really start running it, I guess.
But it's I think because we think it costs less than 1 enter, generally speaking, to replace a card in hand. The cards in hand are cheaper than the enter costs themselves.
And that's why you're saying it can cost 0.5 to equal to an enter. All right. Well, what about the cards in the deck? Since we're always drawing 2 at the top of the turn.
Sure.
And there's more or less a finite amount of cards in our deck. I mean, not accounting for refresh.
Right.
But generally speaking, you only have so many cards in your deck, which gets whittled down throughout the game.
Yeah, so I think the easy thing to think about with this is, Tiffany, if I have an effect that says I mill 3, did that cost me anything?
Unless you paid an enter, no.
No.
I mean, if you're playing a Baphomet.
It's just a free effect, yeah, Baphomet.
Yeah, you just...
Did that cost me anything to do?
I mean, no.
No.
Just probably a card from your hand.
Right. What if I have 3 cards in my deck? Did it cost me anything?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, it just took a damage off of a refresh, didn't I?
Yeah, it cost you a whole life cloth, which is
So
not something you want to lose.
I guess a more common scenario is Deus Shield. When you use it, right, it prevents 1 damage, and then you mill 5 at the end of turn for each damage you prevented. And you can prevent up to 3 damage turns, which means that you could mill up to 15.
God, it's crazy.
So if I Deus Shield at 0 life cloth, and then I mill myself out at the end of turn, was it really a cost?
No.
No.
If anything, you get your deck back at the end of that. It might even be worth doing.
Yeah, exactly.
You shuffle just all the cards back into your deck. Hey, thanks.
That's why, like, when I'm playing X, I'm always counting the amount of cards in my trash, and my opponent's like, "Oh no, he's playing Death Deck," and I'm like, "No, I'm just making sure I'm timing the shield correctly."
Right.
Right. Or like the counterpoint, right? Sometimes I'm in a game against aggro, and I do it, and I'm counting, and I'm like, how many cards left? Okay, so I'll do this, and I'll go down to 6. I'll draw 4 more cards in this game, and then I will either win or lose the game with 2 cards left in my deck. So, like, right, that's when the game's about to give out. So at that point, did the mill cost me anything? And the answer's no.
But you're talking about a specific deck. What about other decks? Like if you've got it, let's say you're playing a No Limit Harana, and you end up getting milled like 10 because you're going up against a diagram.
Sure. Is Hirana likely to...
Does that cost more for that deck then?
Sure. Is Hirana likely to draw their complete deck out?
Yeah. What? Well, no, because they don't have a whole lot of draw.
No, they have the 2 rays, and
Well,
that's about it.
what I'm saying is that it's much more difficult for a deck like Harana to gain back the resource of their deck if they are losing it like that.
Yeah, but are they burning their deck either?
No, not really.
Yeah, they're not playing black, so they're not burning their deck, and they're not playing a ton of blue to draw a lot of cards.
Right.
They might be playing some... It's a valid thing for red, right? Red loots enough that... and looting, by the way, guys, means that you're discarding a card to draw a card. It can loot pretty hard and then filter through its deck pretty hard to find certain stuff. And as such, it's possible to mill itself out, but generally speaking, it's not really going to mill itself out a ton.
It is atypical for a deck to mill itself out without it being on purpose.
Yeah, I think we're going on the deep end here, but the answer is
Yeah.
How much does milling cost you?
It's free.
And I think it's free until you refresh.
It's free until refresh, yeah. Well, it also kind of depends on the...
I think it depends on the deck itself.
And how many life cloth you
Right.
have left. But also, generally speaking, it's free. It literally, you don't have to pay anything to draw 2 every single turn. It's free.
I've played up against no limit decks, right? Or Hirana mid-range decks, things like that. And I've Baphometed out, right? And that mills me 3. And I've always been like, woohoo, free stuff in my trash that I can use later. But then there are times I go up against mono white aggro and they're like bouncer Baphomet, and I'm like, ooh, this is gonna suck when I replay that Baphomet, and then they bounce it again and I replay it and they bounce it again and I go, I just milled myself 12.
Sure.
I might refresh now.
Well, now I think now would be a good time to segue into what a card is worth when it's in your trash.
That's true.
I think this is a little deck dependent.
Super deck dependent.
I mean,
think,
for a lot of cards, for a lot of decks, the trash is the final resting place for your cards for the most part.
Right.
It's only if you're doing something like trash recursion that you fear not the discard deck.
Which basically lives in a single color.
Black.
Right. To a lesser extent, red. Red has some stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Black does. Super Celestia Saber requires you to have white, but also is black dependent. So, yeah, it's a choice. I think that the worth of a card in your trash depends on the deck, right? But I'll say this for like black, for example, it's better draw if you are a black deck, because then you're basically saying I'm going to put a card in my hand, which is the same as saying I'm drawing a card, but instead of it being random, you have a select toolbox to choose from. So arguably, how much is bringing a card from your trash back to your hand worth? Probably more than drawing a random card. So it's probably worth one full enter.
Yeah. I mean, is it worth paying a card to gain a card?
No, actually, I don't think so. That's a weird thing, right? Like, and I think it's a hot take for me to say that, because a lot of people love cards like Moonbite, which is a new card that come out. Basically, bring a card from your trash back to your hand, and it costs one enter. Is it worth it? And the answer is, I guess it's a cantrip, right? Like you are replacing that card with another card, potentially a card that's better. And that is good. But the card that I really like a lot is Machina Smash. And Machina Smash isn't just put a card in your hand from the trash. It is that, but it also kills a Signy. So it does more than just what it stated. So I get more bang for my buck with that.
But not bang.
Not bang. I don't get bang.
So the next currency that we're going to be going into is exceed costs, or cards that you use to exceed.
Right.
Which has become more and more relevant over the past two sets.
Yeah, I mean, sure. So with exceed, right? Like there's a couple magic. There's basically two magic numbers with exceed right now. 4 and 3.
4 and 3, yeah.
Right, because when you fully grow your Elrigs, right? When all of your Elrigs are fully grown, how many cards are under them?
Let's see. 3 cards for your center, and 2 cards for each of your assists.
Right. So
our dog's playing in the background.
That would be a total of 7.
Right.
Right. 2, 2, and 3 is 7. So the answer is, how much does exceed cost? Well, if you do exceed 4, and let's say you just have exceed 4 and no exceed 3s in the deck.
Yeah.
Exceed 4 is free.
Yeah.
It costs you nothing.
It also is not. It's not very much of a risk to you.
Right.
Unless you're playing Madoka or Diagram, where you can where you can replay an assist grow. That's really the only thing I can think of that would hinder you just exceeding whenever you want and however much you want, because after you grow, it doesn't really matter.
No, they're just chilling there. The only you're right to say in Diagram, and can you explain why to our players?
Because it's the center that has the once a game ability. Her name escapes me. I'm so bad at this. Musica, sorry. I keep wanting to say it's Madoka, but I know that's never right. I mean,
Madoka 1.0 and Senga 1.0 also do this effect.
Yeah. So basically, you can regrow a Signy, but you can only regrow a level 1... Sorry, you can only regrow a level 1 Lyrig, assist Lyrig.
Right.
So with the Diagram deck, you kind of have to choose between, do I want to draw or do I want to Lancer again at some point later on in the game? So when you exceed if you exceed a 0 under a level 1, you can't regrow it, because once that level 1 Lyrig leaves the field and there's no level 0 Lyrig to grow on it, it just does not. It ceases to exist, and then you can't replay it anymore. But that's honestly, that's the only instance in the game right now that I can think of where exceed would be bad. And then the other one that I can think of is if you're exceeding souls that do things. Yes. Where, X has this ability where it says if it's used as an exceed cost, then you can do something else.
Yes. And there's one more, which is all the Uchu members. They Kirby.
Right, they Kirby.
Or they use the soul.
Which means that they stack. Yeah. So you have to have a certain number underneath your center Lyrig for it to activate an ability. And if you're using those in exceed cost, you might not be able to activate the full ability
Right.
of the stacking under the center.
Yep. So basically, outside of that, you have to consider what the cost is, and it's free for most decks.
I would say it's free.
You have to consider the fact that, for example, X and Deus have a exceed 3 in their what do you call it? They'll eat their assists. And the
Goodness.
I know I said that horribly. And they have souls that you don't want to be exceeding. So generally speaking, if you're playing a Deus or X deck, you're probably not playing any exceed. Same thing with an Uchu deck, and probably a diagram deck as well.
Yeah.
You could play them in diagram. You just have to make sure you play them late in diagram.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't pay those exceed costs until you're either sure that you don't need to play that ability,
Right.
or you've already played it.
You've already played it. So
Preferably the latter.
otherwise, exceed is free.
It's free. I don't think it's necessarily a cost that you need to be too wary about paying for.
Right.
And that's why we say it's free. It's very low risk currency.
So yeah, so is how exceed is amazing because it's free basically. If I'm playing any deck and I can find a way to stick exceed in there, it's basically just a free upside once.
Is the thing. Yeah, once.
Yeah. It's like how I'm kind of like Superman, the fact that I can stop a speeding bullet once.
Right.
Luckily all the exceed stuff, right? There will be some future cards that are like, don't do anything at all unless you exceed. And those ones are the more dangerous ones to play. At that point, you're like, all right, this is a deck building restriction, but it's not necessarily a cost, right? If you fill your deck with exceed stuff, right, you're not going to have a great game.
You won't be able to do it very much.
Yeah. What's next?
Next on the list, this one was a bit of a toss-up for us. How much is a Signy on your field worth?
Yeah.
How much is that worth?
And so there's a lot of options for this, right? And I think the brass tacks on this one's pretty simple when you really boil it down, which is it your main phase? And if the answer is yes, it's worth an enter because you can replace it with the card, right? It's worth a card in your hand.
So a Signy on the field is worth one card in your hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because if you were to say, I'm going to use it for its down effect, and then it does this cool thing, but I don't want it on the field afterwards because I want to attack with something in that lane, you can replace it right afterwards. If you're doing something like Paimon, where you are in the attack phase and you're sacrificing a Signy, it's now opening up a lane, which is then going to let your opponent hit you for damage. So it's like at that point it's worth one life cloth, which is a lot. But maybe you're an aggro deck and you don't care because you're like, I'm gonna win before this life cloth damage racks up to me. Or maybe you're like, no, it doesn't matter what you do. I'm still gonna use my 3-stop assist Elrig on your turn. So it does not matter if I use the Signy on the field. At that point, you're boiling it down, and it becomes an enter cost at that point. But it's super variable.
Yeah, I would say so. I would say it's probably worth 1 because it is replaceable. Because you can draw cards from your deck to replace it, which we've already discussed is free.
Yeah.
Or it gets cycled into your enter zone, which is also worth 1 because it turns into enter at that point. Or it gets bounced back to your hand, which is now it becomes a 0.5 to a 1 card.
Yeah.
And it's replayable, so maybe its value even goes up in that way. I don't know.
Right.
Or you do your once a game trash. And this is kind of where like things being worth something becomes more important, because are you willing to get rid of a resource to play something else?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'm playing against a red deck and I'm also the red deck. And I look at my card with my hand and it's got 4 cards in hand. And I'll go, play this, do the effects, trash my field, or trash 2 cards in my hand or something like that. And then play out those two new cards that I got, right? And then I'll end my turn with like 1 card in hand. But that's because I'm like, I will win on the next turn. I have one card in my hand and I will draw 2 and that will feel a full field again. And then I'll be able to win. So at that point, the cost of discarding or trashing the Signy on the field is negligible.
Yes. It's also worth noting that if you've played a lot of Wixoss, you will have realized that Signies on your field don't last very long at all. It's not worth getting attached to a Signy.
Yeah.
Which is why cards like Parthenon or Pantheon, that blue card that's like, if it's flipped, it does this. If it stays for 2 turns, it does this.
It comes back.
It has a novel of card text on it, which is very interesting to read through. But the whole idea of that card is that it stays through multiple turns, which automatically makes that card not worth playing, in my opinion, because it's not worth more than 1 card.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, its ability and its worth don't match up properly.
Right. So, for example, another one that you could be, if we're going to keep pulling on this thread here, is Notre Dame. Mm-hmm. Notre Dame has an ability where if it's vanished, I think it's even if it leaves the field, but it's vanished, right? If it's vanished, you can discard 2 cards, and then it comes back into the field downed. Mm-hmm. Is it worth it? And I would argue, yes. Because if it stops a damage, I'm happy to discard 2 cards to stop a damage. And that's because, what is damage worth? You know?
And well, yeah, I mean, now you're trying to say, how much is it worth to save a life cloth, which we'll get into.
Right. I think it's actually a good segue. Let's talk about it.
Let's get into it now, shall we? How much is a life cloth worth?
I know, and it seems like a crazy question to ask. But then you look at that Aresh in your deck and you're like,
Aresh Kagal.
Can I win with you? You're so dangerous.
The answer might surprise you.
You're so dangerous.
The text on Aresh Kagal is basically enter, put 2 of your life cloth into the trash, and clear your opponent's field.
Yeah.
It is very scary
right.
looking at that card. Good art, though.
When you look at it, you go like, that cost is way too high. Unless you win that turn, in which case that cost is absolutely worth it. Mm-hmm. That's sort of its niche. It has such a high ceiling and such a high floor. Like, it's not really a great card.
It's fun to play, though.
But there are some scenarios, like with the Deus deck, which uses the toolboxing of the trash, which we talked about, you know, where you can like, oh, wait, I can win with this card. And you play it, right?
Yep.
And there's some other cards that crush your own life cloth. Mm-hmm. And there are some cards that tax your opponent for not crushing their life cloth, right? Like Projection Map.
Projection Map is a good one.
It taxes your opponent to guard. There's going to be some other ones in the future that are like, pay 1 to attack with the Signy or something like that, right? And the answer is...
Well, there's also Wolf. Because there's that Wolf assist that will, for a cost, allow you to actually regrow a single life cloth. Right. I mean, I think you have to pay 4. You have to pay 4 to do it. And
so the question here is, how much is life cloth worth? And we're going to equate it to enter because, again, that's the easiest thing to equate to.
Right.
Because if we were going to say, how many cards would you discard? You could then equate that to enter, and then you could get the same number. Yeah.
How many enter are you willing to pay to save a life cloth?
Well, I'm gonna do it like an auctioneer here. You tell me when to stop.
Okay.
All right? Hey, Tiffany.
Yeah.
I'm going to crush this life cloth unless you pay 1. What are you going to do?
I'm going to pay 1.
All right. It's 2 now.
I'm probably still going to pay that.
All right. 3.
If I have the enter for it and it's late game, I'll probably do that.
All right. 4.
I might gamble on a Lifeburst.
Right. Okay. And then if I'm like 5.
No, I'm spy.
Okay. So
hope I get a Lifeburst.
So basically, the answer is 3 to 5.
3 to 5 enter. I think it depends on where you are at in the game, but this is to say that life cloth is your most expensive resource. You gotta be very careful with that.
Yeah.
Because it is extremely difficult to renew that in any way. Again, unless you're playing, I don't know if there's any other cards that help you to regrow a life cloth.
There's some in
Wolf.
black later, but yeah.
That's later down the line. But for right now, It's not a renewable resource, really.
It's also the only one that if you spend, you might die.
Case in point, Ereshkigal.
Yeah. Ereshkigal is, when you play an Ereshkigal, you're either winning that game or you're really losing it. Yeah.
I have done both. Which is why, well, that's also why it's especially painful when you have to refresh and trash a life cloth.
Let me tell you the greatest game that I've ever played was where they hit an Anna Mirage Lifeburst. Mm-hmm. And I looked at my life cloth and saw that I was at 2 left. Mm-hmm. And I also saw that I had 1 guard in hand. Mm-hmm. And I rebought my Ereshkigal, crushed my 2 life cloth, and then wiped his field.
Did you win?
Guard, yeah, I went on the next swing back. Yeah, of course I did.
Nice. Nice. But I mean, life cloth is your biggest gamble.
Yeah, I feel like that's also the right way to go out. If you're gonna be like, no, I'm going out myself, Ereshkigal. Yeah, life cloth is definitely your biggest gamble that you can do. But hey, we've made an enter cost for it now, and you can translate that, right? Like you could be like, all right,
is it worth saving this? Is it worth spending a guard to save a life cloth? You can play with that idea. But...
If you look at it right, and you're like, I would spend 2 to 3 enter to save a life cloth if possible, and then discarding a guard is 1 card, and we agree that 1 guard is worth an enter. Or something like that, right? Yeah. Then you end up saying that that's a really enter efficient way to save a life cloth.
It is, and that's why most people run 4 guards.
Yeah, exactly.
And why people don't necessarily put the guards on their field is because the guards are worth much more in their hand than on the field.
Yeah.
So because a guard is 1 card to save a card that is worth up to 5.
Right.
So
what else is on the list?
Let's see. We discussed Signy on the field and life cloth. Let's talk about... Did we talk about souls yet? We had talked about exceeds.
Exceed is pretty close. Yeah, soul, the answer is, I think, free. Because they're free right now.
They are free right now.
There will be a card in, I believe, the next set that taxes them. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly they are no longer free, and you actually genuinely need to start considering how much is a soul worth for you right now. Because right now, putting a level 0 soul on anything is like super free, right? Like you're like, ooh, Deus, negative 2,000, that thing's dead.
Yeah.
Suddenly,
especially when Kentucky's on the field.
Right. Suddenly, if there's 2 of the Signy out that taxes it, and it costs 2 enter to play that level 0, you're like, maybe it's not worth it.
Yeah.
Maybe
that actually kind of plays into the exceed cost, because when you attach a soul to a Signy, and that Signy gets vanished or moved off of the field, the soul doesn't go back under the rig. It goes into the
trash,
the Elrig trash, which means that you can't replay it. So playing a soul will affect the value of your exceed cards.
Right, but your hope is that you're not exceeding away your souls. Like if you're building your deck, let's exceed, to be clear here, exceed is free as long as you build your deck correctly. Mm-hmm. So exceed is free. And your souls are free. Again, that's what we're deciding.
Yeah.
So that's all a free resource for you.
Yeah.
To use as you will.
I think it just depends on which you would rather use. In my opinion, I would rather use a soul. You get there's a lot more you can do with a soul than paying a bulk exceed cost, in my opinion.
Right. You can do one. You're right in the fact that you can exceed once, and then you can soul up to 3 times. Mm-hmm. So you get more out. You're more bang out of your buck. But as soon as, for example, exceed doesn't get taxed ever in the future. It's just a cost. Mm-hmm. So exceed is going to be free until the end of eternity. However, the souls will get taxed in the future by 1 to 2, depending on the opponent, right? And when they're taxed, are they still worth it to play? That's a good question. There's an answer to that question, which is, what are you doing with that soul? If that soul is drawing you a card and you have to pay a enter now to do it, is drawing 1 card for 1 enter worth it? And you and I think the answer is it's on the most expensive side for it still be worth it.
Yeah.
but it is. What if it costs 2? Then the answer is no. It's not really worth it.
Yeah.
What about removal? Now that's a thing we haven't talked about yet, and we probably should have talked earlier than 40 minutes in.
You're gonna say removal is a form of currency?
No, it's but what you can spend it on.
You can. Sorry.
It's a payoff.
Removal is a payoff.
Right. I spend $1 to get a Kit Kat. Removal is my Kit Kat. It's what I get for spending my currency.
Oh. It's a weird way to put it, but sure. Sorry.
I really want Kit Kats right now.
Oh my god. It's Halloween. We're feeling the pull of the Kit Kats. Not sponsored. Not sponsored.
So what are you spending your enter on? And the chances are you're probably spending on your enter on cards or removal.
Right.
So we've answered this question before. What is a good cost for removal?
An enter.
An enter or 2.
Yeah.
Depending on the, like, if it's green, you're probably spending 2. If it's red, you're trying to spend 1.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If it's white, you'd be happy to spend 1.
I feel like black, you would end up spending up to 3 because it gives negatives. It doesn't give. It doesn't say just Spanish.
In some cases, but you're not happy to spend 3. You're happy to spend 2 or 1.
Yeah, it's more difficult to kind of be like, give it -2, and now give it -5, and now give it -1, or like whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking
about. Yeah, I hear you. So the question is, how much does removal cost? And the answer is 1 to 2. So if I'm being taxed 1 on my soul, and my soul is doing removal, I'm probably okay with that. If I'm being taxed 2, probably less okay with that, and it's something I have to consider for souls.
So this kind of goes. Sorry to interrupt. So this kind of goes in the same way that we're equating Lifecloth or figuring out the worth of Lifecloth.
Yeah.
Is we're doing it like auction style, where it's like, how much are you really willing to spend to remove something?
Right.
Like, there's a card in the current iteration of our Ancient Surprise Center Ot deck called Influent D.
Yeah.
And it has a removal cost of 6.
Yeah.
It removes 2 things, but it is 3 green, 3 anything, and it is so expensive.
It only hits 10,000s or higher.
Yeah. So it's really restrictive. And in my mind, it's like, it's never been worth paying that cost except once.
Yeah.
Except once.
Yeah, one time it mattered, which is
one
is fine.
Time.
But
that's only because I could pay for it.
Yeah.
And it was a Nareshkagol situation where I'm like, I have the resources to do this, so I either do this and win or I lose.
Right. And you made the right move to do what you did. But you're right. It's too expensive. And that's something you can think of. So let's also equate to, we're trying to make a payment for removal, and our options are discard, right? Like PA, natural element, gives that option. Discard 2 cards, -8,000 to a thing. Is that worth it? Well, let's equate it into enter. How much are cards in hand worth?
1/2 to 1.
Right. So if we use either of those costs, what do we end up with?
Something that's worth it.
Well, 2. It's we discard 1 card. That's a 1/2 an enter. Discard another card. That's a 1/2 an enter. That's 2 enter, or one enter.
That's 1 enter.
So this effect is worth 1 to 2 enter.
Yeah. That's about on par.
It's on par.
Yeah.
And what's more important about that is you might be tight on enter because you're trying to use your enter for, I don't know, Madoka Clap.
Or you're building up for, like, I don't know, crazy aughts, like 7 different tribal ability.
Right. So the answer to that question is yes. As long as you got the cards in hand to spend, right? Just like anything. As long as you have the enter to spend, it's a good choice too.
Sure. So that's how much removal is, right?
Yeah.
All right. Let's go into how much a grow is worth. So always we're going to be growing our center,
right,
which is worth 0, then 1, then 2.
Right. That's the center cost.
That's the center. But the assist is where it gets a little bit more hairy scary, because there's so many assists that will either be free on their first grow or very, very cheap. I think most of them are free. But the second grow, I mean, it could be anywhere. It's all along the scale. Some of them are worth 0, but then you have to pay for additional abilities.
Yeah.
Some of them are worth like 6, and then there's no additional cost to them.
Yeah.
And some of them ask you to pay for abilities in a different way. So for instance, we have Madoka Clap
Sure.
and Lion Disrespect. These are two of some of the best modular assists in the game because they have a relatively low, let's call it an introductory cost, right, to get one ability. But then the other abilities are pay XYZ out of your enter, okay? So that's now an additional cost that you've already paid from your enter zone to grow. So now you're paying more enter to get a better effect. Then the next costs are to discard cards out of your hand. And this is kind of where this whole discussion came out of is I felt like because you were taking cards out of not only your enter zone, but also your hand, that the cards in your hand felt more expensive somehow to spend. So that's why thinking about currency in your grow costs is so important. It's also important because as an opponent, you have to keep in mind that these are things the person that is playing these cards against you is going to have to pay for. So now you have to resource manage a way to take their resources away.
Sure. So I think the answer, I think it's a very complicated question, is what is the cost of an LRIG grow? Assist LRIG grow. And I think it's a very simple answer, and this probably goes with pieces too. I'm going to lump them both together here.
All right.
Which is, you can't look at the whole thing. You got to look at the payoff. And based on what you're willing to pay for certain things, it is worth it or not. So for example, if I were to say, just in a vacuum here, right? Don't think about any effects.
All right.
This LRIG costs 5 enter and 2 cards to grow.
Ew.
Yeah, that's insane, right? But let me ask you this. Is 2 enter worth it to save a life cloth?
Yes.
Is 3 enter worth it to save a life cloth?
It's a stretch, but probably still, yeah.
The answer is if you have it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is 2 cards worth saving a life cloth?
Yeah.
If I put all of those abilities together and then say that's how each of them is worth, and you can save up to 3 life cloth with it, suddenly it makes more sense as to why that
suddenly
card's
it
great.
feels a little bit cheaper, actually. It almost feels like you're getting a discount.
Right. Let's take Anja's assist. How much do we want it cost, ideally, for removal?
1 to 2.
1 is the cheapest version.
That's
right?
the cheapest,
We want to take. If we get offered 1, we'll take it.
Yeah, outside of a Lifeburst, which could be free removal, it's usually going to cost you 1 or 2.
Right. So Anj bounces 1 and trashes 1. That is really good. Until you realize it's the best version of removal, right? Because you're depriving them of enter.
Right.
So you're getting more bang for your buck other than just removing, and you're doing it for 2 enter. Like, that's great. You've got 1 and 1, and you're doing the premium removal with that. So it's a great assist, right? And then you look at something like Supernova. Why is this card worse then? Supernova bounces your opponent's entire field to their hand for 4 enter, and the answer is.
No.
Well, it's like it could be worth it, right? If we're saying we want the ideal cost is 1 enter per removal, then that number is 3. However, if the removal cost that we're thinking is 2, right, on the more expensive end of the spectrum, we're saving 2 enter because 4 is less than 6.
And this is where we math.
Right. So
and this is how you math in Wixoss.
So it ends up being one of those things where you go like, all right, well, what is that? What is this actually worth to me?
What is this
what is
actually
it really worth to me?
Yeah.
And you'd be surprised. Like, I think Supernova is a great finisher for control decks that don't normally have it, and it's not thought of enough. But again, they're going late, and they have the enter to spend. So yeah, it's that's grow end pieces is dependent on the effects that you get, and you need to judge each of them independently.
Yes.
Right? Like, if you look at Hirana's Stomp's abilities and you put them all in one, Hirana Stomp costs what, like 6 to do its full effect? You never do the full effect. You only are ever doing the one effect, which costs 1 enter, which is a good rate for the effect.
Well, that's what I was going to get into next, and I'm glad that you said that, because that's a really good way for us to get into, like, sometimes it's actually worth more to not fully grow an assist. Obviously, you're always going to fully grow your center. Like, that's not even a question. But sometimes it might not be worth paying for the entire text block on your assist. Sometimes you just need something that's cheap and effective, like Hirana Stomp. Is it Stamp or Stomp? I thought it was Stamp. Stamp with an A. Yeah, I've never paid for the full cost of that because it's never been
Maybe it's
worth
Stomp.
it.
I think it's
Is it?
Stomp. One
No,
of them.
it's the card art where she's standing
Either
and
here or there.
whatever. You guys can look it up. You know the one where it's the Harana assist nobody pays the full price for.
Yeah.
You guys know which one we're talking about. And sometimes even, Lion and Madoka, Madoka Clap and Lion Disrespect, almost all the time, someone will try to find a way to fully pay for them. But at other times, it might not actually be worth it to pay for all of them, or you just don't have all the resources to pay for all of them. But that doesn't mean it's not worth playing.
Often you will, as an aggro player, if you are playing aggro or mid-range, you'll put them in a situation where they've only got 2 lanes open, they can't use it to the full effect, but you did that purposefully to reserve some gas in your hand. Mm-hmm. And you they'll be like, oh, I'm forced to use this, aren't I? Because they'll look at their life cloth and see that they're at 1 and go like, yeah, you're forcing the issue, and you're forcing them to grow, right? They can't use the full effect, but this then opens up your next turn to potentially win the game. You know you're not winning at that turn, so you're not trying to. You're just off. You're saying, I will win this unless you grow at half cost, but then I have more gas in my hand for later. That's one of those parts where we look at resources, and you've got to make the decision as the opposite player how best to screw your opponent in resources.
Yeah.
I think that's all of them, right? We've got.
Well, you kind of bundled in pieces, but do you think we could expand on that just a little bit?
No, I think it's the same. I think it's like, again, what do you get out of it, right? Ancient Echo costs 2 enter to team pump your Signy by 3,000, all of your Signy, draws you 2 cards, and vanishes the opponent's Signy on the opponent's effect.
Honestly,
right?
it sounds like a really good deal.
And if you look at it, right,
That's
and you
a
say,
bargain.
I draw a card for a half an enter and half an enter. I'm already at 1 enter. I'm removing my opponent's Signy. That costs me 1 enter, and then I get a free team buff on it. You're at parity, if not better, with that Signy. Or
What
with
does
that.
parity mean?
Parity means that it is costed correctly.
Okay.
It's on par.
On par.
So it's on par or better.
Parity.
No.
I just had a.
If you are, for example, if you and your opponent are at parity, that means that neither one of you have the advantage, and that's not great for you. You want to be. You want the opponent to not be on parity with you.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, I think it's really what is the cost? Is the cost worth the effect? Mm-hmm. And you can equate that to cards in hand, stuff in your trash, right? If the cost is milling, it's free until you refresh, for example. Right. So you have all these decks, and the truth is, and I think the ending the podcast ideal should be, is you want to maximize on as many resources as you can. Mm-hmm. Because the more free resources that you have, the more variety of resources you have, the more diverse your portfolio is, the more you're able to use, right? If you, in a perfect world, you should end the game with 0 life cloth, all your enter spent, no cards in hand because you used all of the cards in your hand, like 1 card left in your trash, or 1 card left in your deck.
You're talking about playing the most efficient game.
Right. And you've exceeded all of your stuff, and you've done Harmony at least twice.
You've played all your pieces.
Right, and Harmony is another cost that we didn't really touch, but Harmony is
it's free.
It's free, unless you play the second Harmony card and you don't have the Elrig to tap down.
That's rare, though. I've never run into an issue where Harmony's been a problem.
I have.
Oh.
Deus. X.
Really?
X is super free to play Kentucky because you can play 2 in 1 turn. You can't with Deus. Deus, you only have 1 black Elrig to down, aside from your actual Elrig itself, Senator. Kentucky's super free in X, less free in Deus.
I see.
Or I've done that with ZR in Tamago 2.0. Mm-hmm. Or you might end up with a ZR, which needs a Harmony black Elrig, and Phalaris, which is Harmony 2 Elrigs. Mm-hmm. Suddenly, you're like, oh, I can't put both these out at the same time. So, Harmony is a cost, but it's free the first time around. And it's free the first time around every turn.
All right.
But at the end of the day, you're hoping to end the game with having used pretty much every single resource you possibly could.
And that's going to be especially important moving forward, because there are so many small decisions that will greatly impact you turn by turn in the upcoming metas. Like the one that we're going into, which is currently, we're going to be going into set 5 and moving forward, understanding how and when to pay for resources and when it's worth it is going to become so much more important than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why we're taking the time to talk about this today, because some of the biggest issues that I run into when trying to pilot a deck like DXM is because I'm not I'm not managing my resources properly, and then I get screwed over like my turn 4, almost turn 5, if I even make it there. So
yeah, I mean, like, so for example, right, there was in the last loot card tournament where I got first place, I was up against an X deck, and I hit a Morax Lifeburst. That Morax Lifeburst says you can vanish this Signy unless you pay 2. If I pay 2, then I don't have the cost for Madoka Float or for Madoka Clap next turn, and not only that, I was gonna Madoka Clap next turn anyways, so it didn't matter if he vanished any amount of cards on my field because I was gonna shut them all down on the next turn regardless, because that was just the flow of the game was going that way.
Yeah.
So instead of paying 2 and then letting my opponent empty out my field and not being able to play for a full Madoka, I was able to play the full Madoka effect after the fact because I made the decision on my turn when I hit a Life Burst to go ahead and let that card go. Like, that is one of those micro decisions that you have to make when you start realizing how much is a card worth. And the answer was that one Signy lane was not worth the 2 enter that I would have had to pay for it in that scenario. So you have to, yeah, like you said, these are micro decisions that will help you win your game.
And it will either help you win the game or it will cost you the game.
You're right. It sometimes
the
will
ultimate
cost you
price to pay is losing the game.
Correct. Because we said this before, and like in a car, we're like, hey, how much is a card worth in your hand? And you're like, 1 enter. How much is 3 cards worth in your hand? 3 enter. Or anywhere from 1.5 to 3 enter. Yeah, that's the correct answer. How much is the cards worth in your hand when you lose the game at 3 cards in hand?
0.
Because you lost the game.
So that is our discussion on currencies and by extension resources in Wixoss. I am super interested to hear what you guys think about this in the comment section down below. Did you find anything interesting? Is this a new concept for you? Did it even make sense to you? Let us know. I'm so excited to see what you guys think about this. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Lifeburst podcast. Please make sure you subscribe for more, in-depth theoretical decks discussions like this. And as always, may you flip a Lifeburst because they're really expensive. Bye.